My name is Sam Suchdeva. I'm the National Affairs Editor at newsroom.co.nz and author of The China Tightrope, Navigating New Zealand's Relationship with a World Superpower. First off, my sincere thanks to the NZ Institute for International Affairs for asking me to moderate this panel discussion. We've got an excellent lineup of speakers and a great deal to discuss. In mid-2024, the New Zealand government announced a foreign policy reset, responding to rapidly changing and challenging global strategic environments. In practice, this has meant a significantly increased focus on Southeast Asia and South Asia, particularly India, renewed attention to traditional partners, sustaining a deep and comprehensive focus on the Pacific, engagement with multilateral institutions and mini-lateral groupings, and aiming to double New Zealand exports by value in 10 years. The Foreign Minister has accumulated a great deal of stamps in his passport, travelling all over the world, and actually the Labour Party, I think, has undergone a foreign policy reset of its own, so to speak, which hopefully Phil can talk about. There are lots of questions to ask. Does this present the best way to navigate a troubled world beset by US-China competition? Is the strategy advancing New Zealand's economic interests? And is enough being done to include Māori perspectives in foreign policy formulation? This expert panel will assess our foreign policy reset to date and looks to the future in an increasingly uncertain world. Each speaker will have roughly 5 minutes to share their thoughts, and then I'll open up to the floor. So make sure you jot down any questions that you think of during the presentations. First up, we have Labour's Associate Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Phil Twyford. Phil has been the MP for Te Atatu since 2011 and held a number of ministerial portfolios in the last Labour government, including, most pertinently for this discussion perhaps, disarmament and arms control. I've spoken to Phil a number of times, interviewed him, and I can testify to his keen interest in the world of foreign affairs and New Zealand's position in the world, so I'm very interested in what he has to say. Phil, over to you.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank the Institute of International Affairs for convening us today. I'm very pleased to be here on behalf of the Labour Party and to be part of this panel to discuss New Zealand foreign policy in the current context. I want in the time I have to talk about how the different sides of the debate about New Zealand's external relations characterise the current international security and diplomatic environment, and then explore the different approaches on offer. The government, in its speeches and press releases, routinely refers to an increasingly uncertain and contested security environment in Asia and the Pacific. In the deliberately opaque language of foreign affairs, this, as we all know, is shorthand for China's presence in the region. In this narrative, China is positioned as a threat to our national interests and to stability in our region. And that is then the springboard for a foreign policy reset under the current government to a closer strategic alignment with the United States and what are often referred to as the traditional partners. And for that, read the Five Eyes members, but particularly the United States. And for most of the last year and a half, the public debate about this reset has focused on whether New Zealand would be part of AUKUS Pillar 2, the arrangement to share high-end warfighting technology that would sit alongside the first pillar designed to deliver Australia's nuclear submarines. Now, the New Zealand government has had very little to say on AUKUS Pillar 2 since the US elections. But defence engagement with the United States has escalated to include participation in groupings around supply chains, warfighting in space, interconnected naval warfare, and projects on artificial intelligence and cyber capabilities. There are a number of things that need to be said about this, beginning with the idea that China's increasing assertiveness and growing military strength are the root of the problem. The fact is that China is already a great power. Its economy has, on some measures, reached parity with the United States, and it is behaving as great powers do. But as uncomfortable as this may be for its neighbours, this is not the biggest threat New Zealand faces. The biggest threat to our security and prosperity is the possibility of war in Asia between the United States and China. Rising tensions could conceivably affect our trade, and that would be disastrous for us. All-out war, especially if it goes nuclear, would be catastrophic for the region and probably for the planet. Many analysts believe, and I agree, that there is no realistic way the United States can retain the military supremacy in the Western Pacific which it has had since the end of World War II. We're well into a transition from the United States being the leader of a post-World War II international order, and since the end of the Cold War, the world's only superpower, to a multipolar world. The size, demographics, and economic trajectories of China and India mean that they will both be great powers, at least in their own immediate neighbourhoods, with considerable military assets. Seen from this angle, it's not China's great power status which is the biggest threat to us and our national interests. It is rather the risk of competition between two current great powers spiralling into conflict. No matter how you frame it then, we are living in a time of considerable risk. It's not Labor's view that everything is rosy and that we don't need to be concerned. On the contrary, militarisation, great power rivalry, the breakdown of multilateralism, and the daily assaults on international law should concern us all. But the more pressing question is, what is New Zealand's best hope for the pursuit of security and prosperity in the face of all this uncertainty? Let me begin by saying what I think is not in our best interests. When the biggest risk facing your country is conflict in your region between two great powers, joining one of those great powers in its struggle with the other is a high-risk bet in more ways than one. First, it's particularly risky when the great power which you are positioning through your foreign policy statements as a threat is also your largest trading partner. Second, by in effect supporting a strategy of nuclear and other deterrence designed to contain a great power, you risk, I believe, increasing the chance of a war that would be disastrous for all in the vicinity. AUKUS, as Hugh White has said, seems more likely to provoke than deter. Third, I would question whether it makes any sense at all to be pursuing closer strategic alignment with, or being a force multiplier of, the transactional and coercive foreign policy coming out of Washington, DC. In sum, the risk is that New Zealand, by joining a strategy of deterrence under an increasingly unreliable partner, makes a negligible contribution to a losing cause, further provoking an unwinnable confrontation with no security guarantees or economic benefit in return. So what are the options for New Zealand in this environment? For the last 80 years, whether to conduct an independent foreign policy or one characterised by a close alliance with a great power was a genuine choice for New Zealand. But that is no longer the case. The new multipolar world and the demise of the 80-year-old US-led liberal international order leaves us no choice but to find ways to keep New Zealand and our region safe and pursue our national interests through an independent approach. It's our view that we can pursue security for New Zealand and the Pacific through active engagement with our partners across the Tasman and the Pacific and across Asia, as well as being a force for peace and demilitarisation. Our defence capability should be based on a realistic assessment of what the threats are to New Zealand and our interests in the region, not an open-ended commitment to interoperability with the United States and its allies for the sake of being part of a club. New Zealand must be a voice for peace. Nuclear disarmament and international law's rules of war are under threat, but that also means that they are needed more than ever. New Zealand has a credible and principled voice on these issues that should be heard. We must urge the great powers to coexist and share power in the region rather than engage in an arms race and some kind of competition for supremacy. New Zealand needs to up its game in the Pacific. We must be more ambitious in working with our partners in the Pacific Islands Forum to tackle the challenges of climate change adaptation and mitigation and economic development. And in this multipolar world with multilateral institutions under such pressure at the moment, we can still be a voice for the things that we've long stood for, including the rule of law, the rights of small states, disarmament, open trade, and human rights. We're just going to have to work more selectively, independently, and on a case-by-case basis with those who share common interests. In summary, the key elements of the approach are seeking cordial and courteous relations with all, including the great powers in our region, active defence and diplomatic engagement with middle and small powers in the region, and with regional architecture like ASEAN and the Pacific Islands Forum, being a voice for peace, calling for power sharing and détente between the great powers, and advocacy for the Pacific as a zone of peace. Promoting economic security through diversified trade, addressing climate change and its impacts in the Pacific, investing in our soft power via diplomacy and official development assistance, not cutting it. And finally, working with a diverse range of countries to pursue the timeless priorities of New Zealand foreign policy, upholding international law and the rights of small states, disarmament, open trade, and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. That was excellent. Next up, we have Dr. Ruben Steff, a senior lecturer in geopolitics and international relations at the University of Waikato. His research includes great power competition, emerging technologies, and New Zealand geopolitics. He's also the author of 5 books, including New Zealand's Geopolitics and the US-China Competition, which has just come out this year. I have to confess I haven't read it yet, but it is on my list, don't worry. Ruben, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, good afternoon everyone. Thanks Sam, thanks the NZIIA for inviting me and having me. And the check's in the mail, Sam, so don't worry. So me and Phil were just talking off air for a second, saying it's good that we're having a bit of a debate about some of these issues. And I think there's a few more things I heard you say that I'll be happy to debate with over coffee this afternoon. But my tasking, I was asked basically to provide a brief assessment of the strategic environment, a little bit about an assessment of the foreign policy reset, and then a bit about solutions, which is as much about problems as it is solutions in my mind. But when I look at the geostrategic environment, I think there's kind of the macro and then the micro. We can look up Eurasia, right? Those that know their geopolitical theory, we sometimes call this the world island. Throughout the Cold War, you had, for a period of time anyway, the Soviet Union and China allied, trying to push out around the rimlands, out into the oceans, essentially encircled by the United States, its partners and allies. Funnily enough, it looks fairly similar today. Okay, you have a kind of entente, an entanglement of sorts between Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and some other countries that are kind of flirting or hedging in that direction a little bit. And to some degree, we have wars in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and of course, daily threats around Taiwan and the Philippines. So the setup looks a little bit like a second Cold War of sorts. Now, let's be careful. People are very precious about their first Cold War, and they want to say, oh no, it's not another second Cold War. But this is a general concept we can use and apply. Right, so economically, it's very different. The great powers are economically fairly interdependent now, even though some are trying to use that as strategic leverage. But militarily, diplomatically, technologically, when it comes to kind of the information and propaganda domain, to me, that all looks like a pretty high-stakes geopolitical contest is underway between these kind of Eurasian autocracies and, once again, the United States, its friends and partners that are encircling a good chunk of that Eurasian landmass. So you have these powers kind of challenging or pushing out to some degree against the liberal system, whatever is left of that system, and we still have the same kind of allies from the Cold War kind of containing to some degree how that contest plays out. And this is a historical cycle, right? At the end of every great war, or many recent great wars or confrontations, like the Cold War, which ends in 1991, you have the kind of defeated powers, or the powers that perceived they lost or felt humiliated, but over time, as the relative balance of power shifts more in their direction, they then often seek to challenge the existing order, right? The order that the countries that created that order or won the last great struggle have kind of shaped in their image, right, and their values. So that, to me, looks basically like what's happening again in the most starkest, broadest framing of it. That then brings us to the micro, the immediate region. So this great power competition, US, China, etc., is now cascading down into the South Pacific through a variety of ways. And that's why we've actually seen quite a bit of continuity. You go back to Jacinda Ardern, very similar to what Chris Hipkins is saying and does when he's Prime Minister, and what Luxon is saying and doing. Okay? That's because they're responding to the structural pressure. China pushing its influence into the South Pacific, and when it comes to aid, trade, I think there's no problem with that. As Jacinda Ardern said, it's when it starts moving into the security domain, that's telecommunications, internet governance, policing, and looking for military bases, that's when the New Zealand government starts to freak out. Because this is our existential region of importance. Eastern Europe is important, sure. War over there, Middle East, sure. But this is actually the region of strategic depth where we can be directly challenged if things go in a direction that we don't like. And we probably don't want to see military bases popping up around the South Pacific, right? We can all agree to that. Okay, quick assessment of New Zealand foreign policy. The reset, I mean, I think this is a marketing device. You know, we had the reset in 2018, we then had the resilience, and now we have the reset once again. Sure, cool. And I know it's a way to drive a bit of direction through the ministries and whatever, but I see it's basically marketing. And it seems to be focusing on traditional partners, Australia, the South Pacific, to some degree the US, Southeast Asia, focal point on that for a whole range of reasons. It's a critical region in the world, it's growing, it's thriving. Some of those economies are going to be trillion-dollar economies soon, and we're going to want to trade with them. We don't want Southeast Asia falling apart like it kind of did during the Cold War, so the extent that we can prevent that, that'd be great. We also forget about Myanmar, civil war going on over there. Anyway, and we've seen Peters and Collins globe-trotting, the India FTA, which is part of the strategy of strategic trade depth to diversify our trading partners, which is a good strategy at the best of times, but right now it's a key strategy that we need to be opening as many doors as we can. And rhetorical support for the norms and values of the rules-based system. Okay, but again, this to me this reset doesn't look that different than recent foreign policies. Maybe some people disagree with me, that's fine. To me, it looks like quite a long line of continuity. Solutions. This is a tricky one. For a start, I think part of the problem we have is domestic. I mean, by some economic measures, the per capita contraction of recent years has been worse than the 1970s oil shocks and the economy that came out of the Great Recession 2008, 2009. GDP is pretty stagnant, has been for years, and productivity is low. We have a brain drain underway. There's some indication social cohesion is starting to fray a bit. I mean, we're still a lot higher than a number of other liberal democracies, but there's some concerning signs there. Low birth rates, high youth suicide rates, mass literacy, science all declining. We have the culture wars have come here now, albeit in our own domestic context. Information space has been shattered. I mean, I can talk to 10 of my students at university. They're all getting their information from different places. So the kind of common reference points aren't necessarily there. That's a real concern too, because they tend to think our foreign policy capacity is partly based upon at home, how cohesive we are. Do we have a good economy? If our economy's not going anywhere, but other economies are surging ahead, we have less material weight to put behind our foreign policy. How much time? 1 minute. Okay. The region, solution. I can tend to think, like, why can't we push towards some kind of Schengen area or some kind of South Pacific Union? Maybe part of the deal would be that we would then have a kind of demilitarized compact with other countries about the South Pacific. Like, why not just put that idea out there? Let's test it. I don't know. Another thing I think is kind of our mental model. I'm an academic. Our mental model. I mean, I think we're moving into kind of a post-liberal age to some degree. When I think of Trump, Brexit, populism, the failure of Russia, China to liberalise after 91, the fact that according to some metrics there are more autocracies in the world today than there were 1 year ago, the balance is now shifting towards more autocracies than democracies in the world. When I look at wars, failure of Western-led nation-building efforts, tariffs, weaponisation of interdependencies, this to me looks like a kind of post-liberal age. So our mental model maybe has to kind of give up. Like, yes, we are still going to be a liberal democracy, I hope, and we'll work alongside other countries that have our values, but increasingly we may have to start turning a bit more towards also just kind of hard interests. And there are going to be times when we have to emphasise our interests, maybe sometimes even over our values, because that seems to be the pattern of behaviour internationally. It doesn't bring me any joy to say that. So I think shifting our worldview to accept that maybe we're moving to kind of a post-liberal era is something that can be helpful to understand and interpret all these bewildering things we're seeing internationally. So I'll park it there.
Thank you very much, Ruben. Now we have the privilege of hearing from Jackie Kane, a former diplomat and now the Group Head of Strategy and Environment at Te Runanga o Ngāi Tahu. Jackie's 25-year career at MFAT included a stint as New Zealand's ambassador to Chile, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador and Bolivia, and she is currently a member of the Te Hurumanu Partnership Group that aims to ensure Māori values and interests are taken into account by the Ministry's leadership team. Jackie, over to you.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou, ki ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohi a tāhua, te Aotearoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to dip back into the world of foreign policy. I think when I was first asked to come and speak at this forum, it was about the incorporation of mātauranga Māori in foreign policy. And I felt that was really a step too far. Mātauranga Māori being our traditional knowledge systems, taonga tuku iho that are handed down through generations, is really not so readily reflected in our foreign policy, largely because it starts to sort of brush up against traditional state-centric foreign policy frameworks and starts to sort of step into that uncomfortable space of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination on the global stage. So I'll step back from that, but I might come back to it later and talk more about where I've seen Māori perspectives influence New Zealand's foreign policy and where I think there's scope to do more. So in some of the areas where New Zealand has been a thought leader, I think there's been a real influence coming through in terms of Māori perspectives and Māori values. I think we can see that in environmental stewardship, where New Zealand's been a strong advocate for sustainable practices, and we've seen principles such as kaitiakitanga come through in our advocacy for environmental protections in international forums, be that in the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Paris Climate Agreements, and also bringing in Indigenous perspectives into law of the sea negotiations and marine protected areas. So we've seen that Māori knowledge about the environment and its sustainable management has been quite a thread in New Zealand's international diplomacy and environmental stewardship. And I think there's a growing recognition that actually some of the solutions that are needed to some very pressing issues that we face globally around our resource management may be found in traditional knowledge and in Indigenous participation in these conversations. Another thread that I see is in Indigenous rights and the global advocacy that New Zealand has done around that, perhaps more so in the past, and particularly within the United Nations. And there, we've had strong advocacy in relation to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and emphasising the need to integrate Indigenous perspectives on global policy. And then in our own cultural diplomacy and sort of referencing our Indigenous identity within Aotearoa New Zealand, within Foreign Affairs there's been a sort of a willingness to showcase the very unique bicultural heritage that we have here in Aotearoa New Zealand in terms of positioning New Zealand and having a brand that differentiates us from other countries. But I think more than that, it's also sort of the values of whanaungatanga has also sort of seen the interconnectedness of people come forward. And I think back to, probably 20 years ago now when we had the Latin American strategy, and it was not just the focus on the government-to-government relationships or even the business-to-business trade relationships, but on the people-to-people links, because it's when you have those interconnectedness of peoples and cultures of really getting to know a person and create that connection that you can then create these enduring relationships that enable you to pursue your foreign policy objectives. And I think this is resonating with the toolkit of diplomacy that was mentioned in the previous panel. And I feel that as we've had more and more fiscal pressures come across public services around the world and in foreign policy spheres, it's been a drive down towards that sort of more core part, seen as the core part of what foreign policy is, which is this creation of government-to-government relationships. But I think we really need to step back and sort of think about what it is that we're trying to create in the world. I think within our own Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, there's certainly been a lot of advance, certainly since I started as a junior dip many years ago, and we've seen the creation of various groups, not only Te Huru Manu, but other groups that are providing advice into the ministry and helping craft a foreign policy that is uniquely New Zealand. And I think we'll continue to see this in the global conversations that are happening on climate change, sustainability, human rights and cultural preservation. And where it's manifest, I think, most strongly is probably in the sort of trade negotiations in the economic space. And I think this is, tightly linked to what we can see as the strength of the Māori economy and the reality that the Māori asset base has been growing significantly, better than even the rest of the New Zealand economy. So really looking to leverage that offshore as well. I think there's been certainly a lot of movement in terms of recognising the place that Indigenous businesses play, not only within the New Zealand economy, but also internationally as well. So seeing greater work in that area as well. And I was going to speak about a whole range of initiatives that the World Economic Forum has been talking about what is the role of governments in facilitating this. But I see Professor John Meeker is speaking later this afternoon, and given that he was co-authoring one of the key reports in that, I thought that I would leave that to him. But it does, to me, sort of start to speak to that interrelatedness between foreign policy and actually domestic policy. And while I think there's a tendency to see those things in quite separate spheres, the interconnectedness and the strength of the onshore economy and relationships is what we should be reflecting out into our international presence. So I think things that the government can be doing in terms of government procurement, government financing and things to be able to enable more Indigenous businesses to come forward will be to our strength. But when I think about what New Zealand could be doing more, I'm heartened to see across the ditch that there is now the first ambassador for First Nations peoples in Australia. And his role is to be advocating right across the Australian foreign policy about the rights of Indigenous peoples. And I think that's something New Zealand should be looking to follow. In Canada, the Indigenous Advisory Group was established as part of Canada's progressive trade agenda. As I said, we've got different groupings here in Aotearoa, New Zealand that provide that, but I think a more substantive role that actually is part of the offshore negotiations is possible. And I think picking up the point that Professor Caitlin Byron said this morning about that whole-of-nation approach to foreign policy and a national integration agenda, and the point that you were making too, Ruben, around social cohesion, I think we need to take the effort to make sure that foreign policy isn't developed by an elite few in Wellington, but is actually something that the whole country can engage in, because I think as we're facing this disinformation era, people are getting their information from other sources. It's not from their government. And the sort of stretch that we can see as people are sort of more and more suspicious of authority and governments, I think this is, it's even more necessary to involve people, our societies, not just Māori, but all of our sort of super diverse societies within New Zealand in the development of foreign policy. And I think our foreign policy can only be stronger for it. Kia ora.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jackie. And last, but certainly not least, we have Professor Bethan Greener, an international security researcher and the head of School of People, Environment and Planning at Massey University. Bethan's research focuses on how states and others seek to provide for security and what that means for world order. She's published books on international policing, police and military roles in peace and stability operations, and an edited collection on the New Zealand Army. Bethan, over to you.
Thank you. You may not believe this, but I'm actually, I think, going to be walking over some of the ground which my colleagues have already spoken to, and this wasn't organised in that way. I mean, we did have an initial conversation, but things have actually developed in quite a cohesive manner. So when I was thinking about this particular question, the academic in me can't help but go to the question of what is foreign policy. And just as our previous speaker alluded to, I go back to the idea that was promoted by a number of feminist authors, such as Cynthia Enloe, saying that we need to conceive of foreign affairs not as international relations, which tends to put us in the interstate camp, but rather as relations international. That is, we need to acknowledge that the world that we live in, of our imaginations, can be too bound up with a geopolitical, geostrategic and state-based conception that may not actually reflect the reality that we live in. And most recently, we had an author here recently, the very eminent Professor Amitav Vacharya, introducing a new book of his where he talks about the previous and coming world order, and effectively says, don't be scared of the post-liberal order. We've been here before. We've always found forms of order in the Malacca Straits. We've found forms of order in the Middle East. It's not just a European thing. And that's a really good reminder. Another good reminder that he mentioned was we live in a multiplex world where there are different actors beyond states and their contestations. And I think this is reflected quite evidently by the perceptions survey that we heard about this morning, where our predominant concern is around fake news and disinformation. That's not something that's just held. There are state actors, obviously, that are engaged in disseminating that information, but it is not just state actors. So we need to be conceiving of our world as quite a holistic whole. And again, I think some of the work this morning discussed by Caitlin and others around that whole of nation concept will become increasingly pressing. So I think we need to acknowledge that the domestic international binary concept is a false one. And in order to navigate these troubled waters, which are international and domestic both, I think we need our house in order, and we don't currently have our house in order. We need a sense of self, what we value, and if we can conceptualize of this, then we can enter into relationships with others. And I think the work, if I can point you to the work of anyone, I would point you to the work of the most erudite scholar I know, who's Professor Maria Barge here at Victoria University, where she has talked a lot about, in the concept of Māori diplomacy, how can you know how you engage with others if you don't know who you are and where you stand? And so I think that's a really good premise to begin from. We can't engage, thinking of the concept of tākina, we can't engage if we don't know where we're engaging from. And that acknowledges our positionality and our history. And that provides us, I'm going to use another slight domestic private term, it enables us to see through things like being gaslit by other countries. If we have our values and we know what where we stand, we can focus on ourselves and our own goals, because when you begin to play, say, a soccer game defensively, you begin to lose. So I'm keen to see us being more proactive in identifying what it is and what we want. And how do we do this? Well, one of the concerns is bringing that society along, that it's not just, as you say, a proportion of the population. And I think education, the education space is most definitely a place to start, as is the media, as is the question of social media. And from there, we can then talk to others about what our comparative advantage is, and that comparative advantage is being ourselves. It's not being, I think I mentioned this back in 2023, the other NZIIA, it's not being a small Australia or a small United States. And that's where I am cautious about some of the trajectories we're entering into in terms of integration being mentioned. So I work predominantly in a military space. I welcome, interoperability to a certain degree, but the concept of integration leads us more down a path of dependence. Once you begin to buy kit, you are beginning to tie yourself into particular categories or ways of being. I'm also concerned that we might be playing the wrong game. So thinking about technology and the way in which we may or may not enter into arrangements such as AUKUS, or the type of, depending on what naval ships we decide to purchase and the equipment that can go onto those, these are long-term 30, 40, 50-year decisions that we have to make now. So I think caution around that. I also just want to speak to Ruben's mention of the post-liberal age. And again, say I'm not necessarily that fearful of that, in the sense that one of the key or core tenets of liberalism, if you look up the definition, is tolerance towards others. And so it may be that we are discomforted by difference in the world, and we may want to try and advocate for our way of being, but I don't think we necessarily need to automatically see competition or threat. So thinking about that, I would re-emphasise the idea that differentiating ourselves, focusing on things like whakapapa and whanaungatanga are really core, central key values. And from there we can begin to kind of create change or to engage in the world from that particular position. But yeah, thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Bethan. Now, as promised, you'll all have an opportunity to ask some questions. A few notes, which you will have hopefully heard a million times before. Please ensure that your questions are short and that they are actually questions rather than comments. Now, to give you some time to think of what you'd like to ask, I'm going to steal the first question for myself, which goes to all the panellists. It's about the Prime Minister's trip to China. He's flown out today. It's his first visit to Beijing since coming into office. And that, I think, will serve as quite a test of how our foreign policy reset applies to our relationship with Beijing. So I just want to know from each of you what you're most interested to see, or what you're looking for from the Prime Minister's trip, in terms of what does or doesn't happen, what is or isn't said, and how should we be handling our relationship with China. Maybe if we start with you, Phil.
Thanks, Sam. What I'm watching with the Prime Minister's visit to Beijing is whether or not he can bring together the two very divergent narrative strands on our relationship with China that he and this government have been maintaining now for some time. On one hand, it's a special relationship, our most important trading partner, and you saw the Prime Minister enthusing about China's development achievements, reported by the Herald this morning. On the other hand, there is hardly an official foreign policy and defence document in circulation right now that doesn't basically position China as a military threat to New Zealand. And, that is quite a contradiction. And I have no doubt that his Chinese hosts will be watching very carefully to try to read the Prime Minister's sense of the relationship and where New Zealand wants to go with it. But right now, I think that contradiction is a vulnerability for New Zealand's national interests. And I'll be looking to see the extent to which that is portrayed or played out in the visit.
Thanks. I mean, I guess I'm just looking to see if anything surprising or unusual at all comes out of it, or it's just going to be fairly polite, boilerplate, diplomatic speak, which it probably should be, right? Like that's probably the wise thing to do. But just if there's anything unusual, any word or term that we find surprising for whatever reason. What should New Zealand do? I mean, that's a big question. I keep coming back to the South Pacific these days, just thinking like, okay, well, what is the intentionality here? What is China's long-term vision for the region? Is there some overlap, something between them and us that we can truly, I mean, we can agree that human security issues need to be dealt with as a matter of priority, climate change, but then, again, this stuff is going on alongside the kind of great power stuff as well. So they both kind of need to be addressed, in my point of view. And I think to one degree, when it comes to Australia, the US or whatever, every day we mainline their information, their social media, and the US, chaotic media streams. In China, though, because it's behind a firewall, we just don't have the same depth of understanding. And I do think sometimes this is something we overlook, is just the lack of transparency and how that can lead to really some of us feeling a bit paranoid or reasonably concerned. I'm not sure. Sometimes you're paranoid. Are you genuinely reasonably concerned for good reasons, or are you being paranoid because you don't understand? Well, if there's a firewall there, it's kind of hard to truly know what the intentions are. People can sit up here and tell us what the intentions are of Xi Jinping and the Chinese government, but I would like to know more about what they, like a bit more of a deeper view about what they truly view things, what they truly view their intentions to be. And it has to be matched with behaviour, not just rhetoric, right? We've got to separate out rhetoric and behaviour. So.
I think what I'd like to be seeing from this visit is that it's very much based in the values, because I think there is a lot of similarity in cultures in terms of intergenerational outlooks of similar concerns around well-being for our peoples, and that the focus should be on those commonalities, not the differences. New Zealand should be approaching all of its relationships through a national interest lens, and how can we get the best from this relationship for New Zealand and not being drawn into quite unhelpful debates around positioning. These are relationships that we've been living with for decades. This is not something new. These dynamics are not particularly new, manifesting in different ways, so I think we need to hold true to our values in any type of engagement like this.
Thanks. Yeah, tricky question. I think what's already been said makes sense to me, looking for areas of commonality. I think, though, New Zealand is also potentially still, although Jason Young this morning mentioned a little bit more caution and concern from China with regards to what is New Zealand's strategic intention, because we actually, I think, have a disproportionate degree of sway is too strong a word, but there's definitely a disproportionate degree of interest in New Zealand, because we're seen as, I think, a signal for China in terms of, for example, if we decide to join AUKUS, then we are making quite a significant choice in their eyes. And that also would suggest that a country which has been held up as having a number of firsts with China would be definitely putting some more distance between ourselves and China. So I think anything in a security space that looks to be colder will be of significant concern to Beijing. And so I think the same sort of thing. There will be areas where, everything can be to a degree politicized and a narrative constructed around it. But if we're proactive and we look for projects that New Zealand is comfortable with, then again, it's possibly incumbent upon the government or MFAT to be able to articulate why we might be engaging in certain projects with China, and the value of that, of keeping a door of communication open when so many other doors are closing. Yep.
Any questions from the floor?
Hi there, my name's Logan, recent graduate from Vic. It's been presupposed that the Liberal order is in decline, which I wouldn't really contest, but I'm wondering if New Zealand has maybe been complicit or complicit in its decline. I think of two recent actions by New Zealand's Foreign Minister, the sacking of the British High Commissioner, and also the scolding of Luxon for trying to coordinate against Trump's bellicose policy, which has been kind of taken to represent some of the decline of the liberal order. Yeah, to anyone, I guess.
I'll have a go. I'm sure others will too. Yes, quite possibly. Those two could be construed that way. I think that New Zealand's diplomatic approach post the US elections has been characterised by some as subservience and not independence, and I think there's some truth in that. It's grating with a lot of people because it doesn't really reflect, I think, who we are as a country. But I would say that the biggest thing that corrodes away whatever remains of that 80-year liberal order is the complicity and the silence of the Western world in the face of the carnage in Gaza and in Israel-Palestine. And the rest of the world looks at that and just shakes its head at the double standards and the hypocrisy. So the credibility and the moral authority of that old, I think now defunct 80-year order, Palestine is really the thing that I think has chopped the legs out from underneath it.
Right, any questions? One in the front. Oh, right, so we'll start at the back and then we'll come to the front in a second, don't worry.
Kia ora, ko Pietra tōku ingoa no Brazil aho. My question is directed more to Jackie Kane, but anyone that would like to answer, please do. How do you see New Zealand's role in creating or strengthening in international relations between Indigenous peoples so that the experience of Aotearoa New Zealand in Indigenous peoples' rights can help Indigenous peoples in other countries fight for their rights and representation in the decision-making of their countries? Specifically to you, because of your knowledge of different Latin American countries and their Indigenous peoples' experience. Because they are very, very, very far away from New Zealand's experience.
Obrigada. So I think New Zealand has been, an advocate for Indigenous rights, particularly within the UN, outside and in other forums. And I think particularly in APEC, the conversations that have happened initially in the margins of APEC, but then been brought onto the agenda and meetings being organised alongside APEC to bring together Indigenous peoples and create the opportunity and space for people to come together and then to be advocating into government about what is required to sort of bring forward the economic wealth from Indigenous communities. So I think there are pockets that are happening. Another initiative I'm aware of is the World Indigenous Business Forum that has been held in Latin America a number of times, and I think has been held later this year in Melbourne. Is another grouping of people coming together to be able to share the challenges, create networks, create alternative platforms for some of these conversations to have. So whilst I do think that there is a role for government to lean in and support these conversations, I think creating this space and opportunity for more Indigenous to Indigenous engagement to happen is also necessary. And I think in doing so, acknowledging that the way a lot of the international frameworks have been constructed have not necessarily been with the mind of Indigenous participation. So I think that needs to be considered as there's more or growing interest in advocating for Indigenous perspectives within different frameworks, leaning in to create the space for those conversations to happen.
Hello, I'm Albert. I'm the student rep from Wellington High School, And I just have a couple questions about earlier. Even in the morning, it's already been mentioned about New Zealand, like economically, New Zealand is heavily relying on Australia, China, India, and United States. In terms of that, I wonder how Donald Trump, like the way he disrupt the international order, and if there is any issue between China and Taiwan, do you think New Zealand will be affected by in terms of that part? And the second question is about as there are many, let's just say in terms of Chinese or the other countries, but just like in terms of immigration, there has been many people moving to New Zealand. Do you think there will be a big concern for national security? Thanks.
I mean, the second piece, concern for national security, I don't know. I imagine there's a little bit of concern, given sometimes it's been put out there that the Chinese diaspora community in New Zealand can be perhaps sometimes, I don't know if the word is leveraged, but it maybe even sometimes compelled by authorities back home in China to do things in New Zealand. So I imagine our SIS and people downtown probably have some concerns about those kinds of possibilities, or at universities, maybe looking for IP, intellectual property and so on in sensitive areas. I don't think amongst like mass society there's a concern. I would like to think the average New Zealander isn't walking around all that concerned, but that may not reflect what's happening down at the governmental level. And your first question, could you clarify quickly, is if there's a kind of crisis or conflict between China and Taiwan, does that have implications for New Zealand? Is that?
What I mean by that was currently there are two big issues. Well, there are lots of issues happening, of course, yeah, but there are two big issues regarding United States and the relationship between China and Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
If there, because there is already something going on, but if there is a real war happening there, and also in with how Donald Trump disrupt international order economically, do you believe New Zealand need to adjust the foreign policy in terms of that part?
Does anyone else want to have a go at that one?
Question again. So I would just like to come back to your second question around the growing migration into New Zealand. I mentioned it in my earlier comments around New Zealand's super diversity, and this has been seen as a real strength in the past. But I think what I would say is that in terms of national security, it's actually making sure that our government agencies understand the changing demographics of our country and reflecting that appropriately within our national security settings and our national security conversations. So I think it's more of an issue for us looking outwards and making sure that we've got the right settings in place for what is quite a different population than we had, say, 50 years ago. We're now in a place where a quarter of all New Zealanders were not born in New Zealand, so their experiences are different. The way that they may view government agencies or our security agencies is very different, and making sure that the people within those security agencies are thinking about New Zealand settings is also cognizant of our changing demographics. So I think that's another element that we should be thinking more about as a country, and making sure that our national security conversations are actually inclusive of what is a very different population than we've had in the past.
I'm not sure I'm going to answer your first question very well, but I mean, I think one of the things that's really important that we acknowledge, and I think it's been referred to a couple of times today, is that should there be any significant conflict, whether or not that's US-China, China-Taiwan, the consequences are devastating, not just in terms of physical life, militarisation, but even if you are trying to stay out of such a conflict economically, it would be absolutely horrendous for a trading country, particularly like New Zealand. You know, we send so much of our goods up through the straits. It would be absolutely astronomically terrible. So I think, again, any effort that we can put into prevention, and I find this really interesting because conflict prevention, it was a really good conversation, I thought, by Lise Howard earlier, actually indicating how many times, although we tend to think in popular parlance of the UN as failing, we don't acknowledge how many times it succeeds, because when you successfully prevent conflict, you don't hear about it. You know, how many people know about NATO's conflict prevention in Macedonia in like the early 2000s? No one, because it worked. Or the UN in Burundi? No one, because it worked. So I think this is something else I think the New Zealand government could get really a lot more attuned to and engaged in. It's huge in ASEAN. It's a major plank in Southeast Asia, conflict prevention. And this is where we should be putting our efforts, because a bit like the question of the climate crisis, actually preventing the problem before it becomes a crisis would be very wise. We're just not very good at sometimes being longitudinal in focus. And I do think that's where, you know, thinking about intergenerational thinking, we're going to have to lift our game. Yep.
I'll just quickly go back to the first question. So we have these these P8s, these Poseidon 737s, militarized 737s essentially. So if there was conflict between Taiwan, China, and pulls in the US, Japan, Australia, and so on, Australia being our only formal ally, former Minister of Defence Andrew Little said we could be called on to play a role. So that means get those P8s up into the air looking for Chinese submarines, given the South Pacific could be the soft underbelly to any conflict going up further to the north. So we would be implicated. How that would play out, what we would do, would all depend upon that moment and the decision made and the context. But we are militarily, to some degree, entangled into what happens up there. And then there's obviously the trading aspect. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Anything, Phil?
I can't resist that.
I'm not saying I endorse it, I'm just saying.
Yeah, no. I think the Taiwan issue, I think it's good that people are finally kind of talking about this in the open, because it is a very real scenario. And you know, I don't know if people saw the story in the Australian Financial Review yesterday, where the Security Commentator Hugh White was saying that the US government's review of AUKUS that they've just announced he was speculating that it's essentially an attempt by the administration to get Australia to publicly commit to fighting alongside the US in the event of a conflict over Taiwan in order to nail down the nuclear submarines under AUKUS. And that it's only that kind of commitment that would make the US give up the nuclear submarines to Australia that it actually really needs for its own fleet. And so this has now become, you know, this is becoming part of the public debate. And I think for New Zealand, for where we sit in the world and our aspirations and values, we should be, I think, taking a very different position to where the Australians are at. Australians are locked into this. As part of the AUKUS deal, they are basing nuclear-capable nuclear bombers and submarines on Australian soil. So it's impossible under that scenario to think that they won't be a target, a military target, if there's a hot war between China and the US. Do we want that?
We're allied with them.
Well, that doesn't mean.
What does that mean for
No,
us?
well, it doesn't mean that we have to commit, certainly not in advance, to fighting on the side of the US and Taiwan. I think if we need to be saying to the US, if we consider the US to be a friend, we should be saying, don't do this. Don't put Asia and the Pacific and the planet at risk in this foolhardy, unwinnable quest to hold on to military supremacy in the Western Pacific. That's what we should be saying to them, not, okay, if you get into a hot war with China over Taiwan, we'll back you, because I don't think we should.
Great. We've got time for one or two more questions. Maybe we can sneak an extra one in if we're fast. So we'll, head down the back.
Kia ora, everyone. My name is Mina, University of Canterbury. So my question concerning New Zealand foreign policy towards the Middle East. So the Middle East is now going through what we can call uncertainty and reshaping. The conflict between Israel and Palestine and the recent escalation between Israel and Iran. So my question is, how could New Zealand be affected by this reshaping of the Middle East? And second question, what is the best course of action for New Zealand government towards what's happening, especially if United States decided to get involved between Iran and Israel?
Okay. I just said to Sam, am I talking too much? I want to answer this question because I think that how the world responds to the conflict in Israel-Palestine is so important right now. And it's at the heart of the instability. It's not the only thing, but it's at the heart of the instability and conflict in the Middle East. And, you know, the Western world has basically given Israel more or less unconditional support for most of the 77 years of the State of Israel's existence. And it has enabled and in the case of the US, funded and armed the onslaught on Gaza for the last year and a half, 55,000 people killed and a city destroyed. And I think there has to be a change. And I think that there are some countries like Spain, Norway, Ireland and others who are breaking away from that, the old US-led Western consensus that has perpetrated such a terrible injustice on the Palestinian people. And I think that a country of conscience and principle like New Zealand, we should be standing there alongside Ireland, Norway, Spain, the likes of Malaysia, South Africa, and actually saying this has to stop. And Israel's ongoing and egregious breaches of international law, as documented by the International Court of Justice, has to be the wake-up call that the West hears. And I think that's the only way that there'll be some kind of resolution that deals with the fundamental problem.
Right, lucky last question, I think, if there is anyone who's got a question. Yep, just...
Kia ora whānau, Hone McGregor from Te Taumata. Just building on that and around resetting, I think last week we saw UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Norway, I think, do a sanction on Israeli politicians. Can I have your thoughts on the implications for the intelligence sharing Five Eyes group with New Zealand in it?
I think there are quite big implications. If intelligence gathering that New Zealand is part of is generating data that is then used by Five Eyes partners in relation to the perpetration of what I regard as a genocide in Gaza, we should be concerned about that.
I mean, I don't know if practically it's going to affect the Five Eyes in any way. I mean, this is one of the kind of paradoxes of the age of Trump, where we're all worrying, we're all waiting for like, oh, when's he going to pull out of NATO? When is the Five Eyes going to collapse, what have you? And none of it's happened. So I just tend to be a bit conservative about these issues and to assume the Five Eyes is going to keep going, and there'd have to be some really epic rupture amongst the intelligence partners for it to truly affect it. That's...
I guess thinking in particularly about intelligence, you know, when you gather intelligence and you share it with friends and allies, then there is the chance that it will be shared again. And we just need to be cognizant of that. And we also need to be cognizant of that as we enter into the space industry to a much greater extent, whether or not that's private or public interests in that space. So I think, yeah, that's a really thorny question, particularly around the issue in Palestine. And what is becoming quite apparent is the number of different countries that are actually being quite complicit with respect to the sharing of information and the clearing of airspace and things like that. So I'm pleased to see there being some pushback against the Israeli actions at this stage. I just think we need to, I think what New Zealand and others need to do potentially is to try and conceive of what would be the right side of history and navigate from that.
All right, I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but thank you very much to our panellists for their insights, and thank you to everyone in the audience for your thought-provoking questions.